Breathing and exchange of gases is one of the highest yield chapters in NEET biology. It shows up almost every single year, sometimes in 2 or 3 questions at once. In the next few minutes, we're covering the entire chapter. The path of air, how breathing actually works mechanically, every volume and capacity you need to memorize, how oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported in your blood, how your brain controls your breathing rate, and the disorders NEET loves to ask about. Keep a pen ready for the numbers. There are a lot of them, and NEET loves testing exactly these numbers. Let's get started. Before we even get to humans, it's worth remembering that different organisms breathe in completely different ways depending on their habitat. Simple animals like amoeba exchange gases directly through their body surface by diffusion. Earthworms breathe through their moist skin. Insects use a tracheal system. Air enters through spiracles and travels through tubes called tracheae directly to tissues, without even involving blood. Fish use gills. Amphibians use both skin and lungs, and birds and mammals rely on lungs. Humans are lung breathers. And here's the path air takes on its way in. It starts at the nose, where hairs and mucus filter the air and warm and humidify it. From there, it passes through the pharynx, which is a shared passage for both air and food. Then the larynx, or voice box, where a flap called the epiglottis guards the entrance to the trachea, so food doesn't go down the wrong way when you swallow. The trachea itself is the windpipe, held permanently open by C-shaped rings of cartilage. It then splits into 2 bronchi, one going to each lung, which branch further into narrower bronchioles, which finally end in alveoli, tiny air sacs, and the only place in this entire pathway where gas exchange actually happens. Everything before the alveoli, nose through bronchioles, is called the conducting zone. This gives us the upper respiratory tract, from the nose to the larynx, and the lower respiratory tract, from the trachea down to the alveoli, which is where gas exchange actually happens. NEET also loves testing the difference between breathing and respiration as concepts. Breathing is a purely physical, mechanical process happening in your lungs. It just moves oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. It doesn't consume the oxygen. Respiration is the chemical, biochemical process happening inside your cells, in the mitochondria, where oxygen is actually used to oxidize glucose and release ATP. Remember that distinction. It's a classic one-line NEET question. Now let's look at the lungs themselves. They're paired, cone-shaped, spongy, elastic organs sitting in the thoracic cavity. The right lung has 3 lobes and is broader and shorter, while the left lung has only 2 lobes, narrower and longer, because it has to leave room for the heart. Each lung is wrapped in a double-layered membrane called the pleura. The inner layer, tightly hugging the lung surface, is the visceral pleura, and the outer layer, lining the chest wall, is the parietal pleura. Between them is a thin film of pleural fluid, which reduces friction as the lungs expand and contract with every breath. Let's do a quick check on what we just covered. The lungs and pleura. Now to the actual exchange units. The alveoli. These are tiny air sacs with walls just 1 cell thick, made of thin squamous epithelium, built specifically for fast diffusion. Each one is wrapped in a dense network of pulmonary capillaries. There are roughly 300 million alveoli in each lung, and together they give a combined surface area of about 70 square meters, roughly the size of a tennis court, all folded up inside your chest. Gases actually have to cross a 3-layer barrier called the respiratory membrane, the alveolar epithelium, then the basal lamina, then the capillary endothelium. This barrier is only 0.2 to 0.6 micrometers thick in total, and that extreme thinness is exactly what allows such rapid diffusion. One more detail NEET likes to test. A thin film of surfactant lines each alveolus. It reduces surface tension and stops the alveoli from collapsing every time you exhale. Now, where does the actual gas exchange happen? There are 2 zones. External respiration is the exchange between the alveoli and the blood, happening inside the lungs. Internal respiration is the exchange between the blood and the tissues, happening throughout the rest of the body. Both are driven purely by simple diffusion. Gases move from high partial pressure to low partial pressure, with no energy required. Oxygen diffuses from alveoli to blood to tissues, while carbon dioxide diffuses the opposite way, from tissues to blood to alveoli. Now for the mechanics of breathing, how air actually gets pulled in and pushed out. This all comes down to one physics principle, Boyle's law. P1V1 equals P2V2 at constant temperature. In simple terms, when volume goes up, pressure goes down, and when volume goes down, pressure goes up. During inspiration, which is an active process, the diaphragm contracts and flattens, moving downward, while the external intercostal muscles contract, pulling the ribs and sternum up and outward. This increases the volume of the thoracic cavity, which drops the pressure inside below atmospheric pressure. And because gases move from high to low pressure, air rushes in. Expiration, at rest, is passive. The diaphragm and external intercostals simply relax. The diaphragm domes back upward. The ribs move down and inward. Thoracic volume decreases. Pressure rises above atmospheric, and air is pushed back out. No active muscle contraction needed. But during exercise or any forced breathing, expiration becomes active too. Internal intercostal muscles and abdominal muscles contract to actively pull the ribs down and force air out faster. Here's how pressure and air movement track through one full cycle. At rest, before inspiration starts, pressure inside the thoracic cavity equals atmospheric pressure, and there's no air movement. During inspiration, pressure drops below atmospheric and air moves in. Briefly at rest again after inspiration, pressure returns to atmospheric. Then during expiration, pressure rises above atmospheric and air moves out. That whole cycle, repeating, is what keeps you breathing. This next part is pure memorization, and NEET tests it constantly. So let's lock in the numbers. 4 respiratory volumes. Tidal volume, or TV, is about 500 milliliters, the air moving in and out during one normal, quiet breath. Inspiratory reserve volume, IRV, is about 2,500 to 3,000 milliliters, the extra air you can force in after a normal inspiration. Expiratory reserve volume, ERV, is about 1,000 to 1,100 milliliters, the extra air you can force out after a normal expiration. And residual volume, RV, is about 1,100 to 1,200 milliliters, the air that always remains in your lungs, even after the most forceful possible exhalation. These 4 volumes never overlap, and if you add all 4 together, you get your total lung capacity. Quick check time. Let's test what you remember about respiratory volumes. Now the 4 capacities, which are just combinations of 2 or more volumes. Inspiratory capacity equals TV plus IRV, roughly 3,000 to 3,500 milliliters. Functional residual capacity equals ERV plus RV, roughly 2,100 to 2,300 milliliters. Vital capacity equals TV plus IRV plus ERV, roughly 3,500 to 4,600 milliliters. This is the maximum air you can forcibly exhale after the deepest possible inhalation. And total lung capacity equals vital capacity plus residual volume, roughly 4,500 to 6,000 milliliters. NEET often shows you a spirometer trace and asks you to identify a volume or capacity from it. One more table worth locking in. The composition of air changes as it moves through your lungs. Inhaled air is about 21% oxygen, 0.04% carbon dioxide, and 78% nitrogen. Exhaled air drops to about 16% oxygen and rises to about 4% carbon dioxide. And alveolar air, the air actually sitting in your alveoli, is about 14% oxygen and 5.5% carbon dioxide, with nitrogen edging up to about 80.5%, since it isn't consumed at all. Let's put real numbers on those pressure gradients. In the alveolar air, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 104 millimeters of mercury, and carbon dioxide is about 40. In deoxygenated blood entering the lungs, oxygen partial pressure is about 40, and carbon dioxide is about 45. In oxygenated blood leaving the lungs, oxygen jumps to about 95, while carbon dioxide drops back to about 40. And at the tissues, oxygen is back down to about 40, while carbon dioxide is about 45. This is formalized in Fick's law of diffusion. The diffusion rate is proportional to the area, the solubility, and the pressure gradient, and inversely proportional to the membrane thickness and the square root of the molecular weight. Here's a classic NEET trap. Carbon dioxide is 20 to 25 times more soluble than oxygen, so it diffuses efficiently across the membrane, even though its own pressure gradient is much smaller than oxygen's. Now let's talk transport. How oxygen actually travels through your bloodstream. About 97% of oxygen binds to hemoglobin, forming oxyhemoglobin. And each hemoglobin molecule can carry up to 4 oxygen molecules. That's because hemoglobin is built from 4 polypeptide chains, 2 alpha and 2 beta. And each chain is wrapped around one heme group containing an iron ion, which is exactly why one hemoglobin molecule binds exactly 4 oxygen molecules. Only about 3% of oxygen dissolves directly in plasma. Binding is favored in the lungs, where oxygen partial pressure is high, while release is favored at the tissues, where the opposite conditions apply. Let's pause for a quick check on oxygen transport. It's worth knowing the difference between hemoglobin and myoglobin here too. Myoglobin sits inside muscle cells and stores oxygen locally, with just one heme group and a higher oxygen affinity than hemoglobin, which is why it holds on to oxygen more tightly and only releases it under real muscular demand. And hemoglobin isn't the only respiratory pigment in the animal kingdom. Mollusks and arthropods like Pila use hemocyanin, a copper-based blue pigment, while some annelids like Nereus use chlorocruorin, an iron-based green pigment. Now for carbon dioxide transport, which happens 3 ways. About 70% travels as bicarbonate, formed inside red blood cells by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. About 20 to 23% travels as carbaminohemoglobin, bound directly to the globin protein, not the same site oxygen binds to. And about 7% simply dissolves in plasma. As bicarbonate diffuses out of the red blood cell into plasma, chloride ions move in to balance the charge. This is called the chloride shift. Then there's the Haldane effect. Deoxygenated hemoglobin, out at the tissues, has a higher affinity for carbon dioxide, so it picks it up easily right where it's produced. But in the lungs, as hemoglobin binds oxygen, its affinity for carbon dioxide drops, so carbon dioxide is released efficiently for you to exhale. The mirror image of the Bohr effect. Let's move to how your body controls breathing. The main control center is the respiratory rhythm center in the medulla oblongata, split into a dorsal group that drives inspiration and a ventral group that drives forced expiration. The pneumotaxic center, sitting in the pons, moderates that rhythm center. Near the rhythm center is a chemosensitive area that is highly sensitive to carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion levels, but only mildly sensitive to oxygen. There's also a protective reflex called the Herring-Brewer reflex. Stretch receptors in the lungs detect overinflation during a deep breath and send an inhibitory signal to stop inspiration, protecting the lungs from overstretching. Now the disorders NEET tests most. Asthma is caused by allergies, dust, smoke, or cold air, and causes inflammation and narrowing of the bronchioles, leading to wheezing and breathlessness. Bronchitis inflames the bronchi and causes excess mucus and cough. Emphysema destroys the alveolar walls, reducing surface area and causing breathlessness. Pneumonia fills the alveoli with fluid or pus. Tuberculosis, caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, causes persistent cough, fever, and weight loss. And silicosis, from long-term dust exposure, causes chronic inflammation and fibrosis of lung tissue. COPD is the umbrella clinical term covering chronic bronchitis and emphysema together. One more quick check, this time on respiratory disorders. Here's the classic NEET trap. It's carbon dioxide, not oxygen, that is the primary trigger driving changes in your breathing rate, because the chemosensitive area responds far more strongly to carbon dioxide than to falling oxygen. This is exactly why altitude sickness happens. At high altitude, atmospheric oxygen drops sharply, but carbon dioxide barely changes, so the chemosensitive area doesn't fire strongly right away. And that delay is why altitude sickness sets in before your body adjusts. The same chemosensitive area responds to exercise too, just much faster. As muscles work harder and produce more carbon dioxide, that rising CO2 quickly drives your breathing rate up to compensate. And that's the entire chapter. Breathing and exchange of gases, fully covered, top to bottom. If this helped you lock in the numbers and the traps NEET loves to test, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me which chapter you want covered like this next. Tomorrow, we're going deep on a topic that builds directly on everything you just learned: the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, the sigmoid curve, P50, and exactly what shifts it left or right. See you in the next one.